By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final phase. American forces were steadily advancing toward the Japanese homeland, capturing one island after another. Each of these islands held strategic value, but Iwo Jima stood apart for reasons that were immediately clear to military planners. This small volcanic island, only about 20 square kilometers in size, lay directly along the flight path between the Marianas and Japan. Its airfields could provide critical support to bombers returning from missions over the Japanese mainland. Securing the island became a logical and necessary step. Yet no one expected that the first minutes of the landing would become one of the most puzzling episodes of the entire Pacific campaign. Preparations for the assault were extensive. Naval artillery and aircraft bombarded the island for days, targeting fortifications and suspected defensive points. Observers noted that some structures appeared destroyed, interpreting the lack of visible activity as evidence that Japanese defenses had been severely weakened. Reports suggested that although resistance was likely to be strong, it might not reach the intensity seen on other islands. Commanders believed the first waves of the landing force would be able to establish a foothold despite inevitable delays. When the landing craft approached Iwo Jima on 19 February 1945, the beach seemed unnaturally quiet. No muzzle flashes, no rifle fire, no visible movement. The gray volcanic sand, drifting smoke from earlier bombardments, and heavy haze created an indistinct terrain. But the absence of enemy fire struck many experienced officers as unusual. This silence contradicted expectations. The island, known for its network of fortifications, looked dormant and lifeless. At 9:02 local time, the first wave of American troops stepped onto the shore. Progress was slow as Marines sank into the loose volcanic sand. Vehicles stalled, and the artillery units meant to deploy immediately after landing struggled to move across the unstable ground. Still, no fire came from the island. Some officers began to assume that the bombardment had destroyed much of the Japanese defensive network or forced the remaining troops deeper inland. Those first 4 minutes recorded by observers and later studied extensively became the focus of historical scrutiny. In this brief window, the initial companies reached the beach, engineers began unloading equipment, and several orientation markers were set. Some Marines even started advancing further inland, while others were still disembarking. Visually, the operation appeared unexpectedly successful. Without incoming fire, units could concentrate on forming a beachhead. Reports written in those early moments describe the situation as a strange silence, a phrase that in wartime often signaled hidden danger. The cause of that silence was entirely unknown to those on the beach. At the time, no one realized that the Japanese defensive strategy had changed fundamentally. On previous islands, Japanese forces attempted to repel landings with immediate, overwhelming fire. But General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Iwo Jima garrison, rejected this doctrine. He dispersed his forces throughout an intricate system of underground tunnels, fortified chambers, and concealed firing positions carved deep into volcanic rock. His plan was to strike not as the landing began, but only when the maximum number of American troops and vehicles were concentrated on the exposed beach. This decision created the core of the 4-minute mystery. While American troops struggled through the unstable sand, the defenders remained silent. Observers mistook the lack of activity for evidence that the bombardment had done critical damage. In reality, most Japanese troops were positioned far below ground in reinforced positions designed to withstand air attacks. They were waiting for the moment when their fire would be most devastating. The calculated pause represented one of the most precisely executed tactical decisions of the Pacific War. In 4 minutes, the number of troops, vehicles, ammunition crates, and engineering equipment on the beach reached a density that created an enormous tactical vulnerability. From the Japanese perspective, this was the ideal moment to strike. Military analysts would later examine these events repeatedly. Some described the timing as extraordinary luck. Others believed it was the result of meticulous planning. But on the beach, no one yet knew that the silence was intentional. To the landing forces, those first minutes felt manageable, even hopeful. And for that reason, what happened immediately afterward was perceived as sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to anticipate. The silence that greeted the landing on Iwo Jima was not a coincidence, nor the result of bombardment damage. It was the central element of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's defensive strategy, one radically different from previous Pacific battles. While American planners assumed the island's fortifications had been neutralized, Kuribayashi had prepared a defense based on endurance, concealment, and a single devastating moment of counterattack. Before the invasion, he ordered the construction of a vast underground system that reached nearly every corner of the island. Engineers and soldiers carved miles of tunnels into volcanic rock, creating chambers for ammunition, command posts, and living quarters. These positions were reinforced to withstand bombardments that would have destroyed traditional trenches. Ventilation shafts disguised among natural formations allowed Japanese troops to stay underground for long periods without exposing their locations. Kuribayashi prohibited wasteful attacks and banned suicide charges. His intention was to turn the island into a controlled environment where every meter of ground could be contested. Instead of defending the shoreline, he stationed his forces deeper inland, where their firepower would be most effective. The beach itself was treated as a trap, a natural bottleneck, where Marines, vehicles, and equipment would inevitably gather. During the days of naval and air bombardment, this underground network proved its value. While the surface appeared shattered, most defenders remained unharmed. Observation posts, hidden in hardened casemates, continued to track American preparations. Reports from these positions allowed Kuribayashi to estimate the timing and density of the landing waves. The delay between landing and engagement, the 4 minutes later noted by analysts, was a deliberate pause designed to allow the maximum possible concentration of targets. At the moment of landing, American commanders believed the fire had ceased because the bombardment was successful. But beneath the ground, Japanese artillery crews waited for a signal. Machine gun nests, invisible from air and sea, were locked on fixed angles. Mortars were calibrated to impact the precise areas where landing craft and equipment were accumulating. The defensive network required patience, and Kuribayashi's men had been instructed repeatedly not to break discipline by firing too early. While the Marines moved across the beach, engineers struggled to position heavy equipment. Tanks and transport vehicles stalled in the loose volcanic sand, creating congestion. The density of personnel grew quickly as consecutive waves disembarked. American units were adapting to the terrain, unaware that their attempt to stabilize the landing zone was the very moment Kuribayashi had prepared for. The Japanese general understood that his forces had no hope of repelling the invasion entirely. His goal was to inflict maximum losses, disrupt the pace of the offensive, and delay American progress long enough to influence strategic decisions. He expected his troops to fight for as long as physically possible, using every tunnel, every chamber, every reinforced position to prolong resistance. The silence before the first shots was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strict calculation. From underground command posts, observers tracked the increasing movement on the shore. The density of vehicles, personnel, and supplies reached critical mass within minutes. Only then, after the beach became overcrowded and escape routes limited, did Kuribayashi issue the order to fire. It was a single, decisive command that would transform the landing from an organized operation into a chaotic struggle for survival. The 4-minute window, later analyzed in detail, was the turning point where expectations diverged sharply from reality. American troops believed the initial absence of fire signaled a weakened defense. Kuribayashi viewed the same moment as an opportunity to strike when his enemy was most exposed. This divergence in understanding would shape the rest of the battle, turning Iwo Jima into one of the most grueling engagements of the Pacific War. The moment Kuribayashi's signal reached the underground positions, Iwo Jima transformed. The silence that had defined the first minutes of the landing vanished behind a sudden, coordinated eruption of fire. Observers later described it not as the beginning of a battle, but as the moment the island itself seemed to awaken. Every hidden position that had remained dormant during the bombardment came to life with calculated precision. Machine gun nests, previously invisible, opened fire from reinforced apertures cut into the slopes and ridges. Mortars launched coordinated volleys that struck areas where equipment and personnel were most densely concentrated. Artillery hidden within caves targeted the beaches with pre-measured accuracy. What made the situation even more disorienting was the absence of visible enemy positions. Marines struggled to identify where the shots originated. The island's terrain concealed nearly every weapon. The volcanic sand, already difficult to move through, now became an additional hazard. Vehicles that had stalled earlier formed obstacles, restricting movement and blocking attempts to disperse. Engineers attempting to unload supplies found themselves in open terrain with limited cover. The density that had seemed manageable only minutes earlier became a severe tactical disadvantage. Reports compiled after the operation emphasized the structure of Kuribayashi's defensive network. Rather than relying on linear fortifications, he had created an interlocking system of fire zones. Each machine gun nest supported another. Mortars were arranged so their arcs overlapped. Artillery pieces were positioned in deep chambers, shielded from counterfire, and connected through tunnels that enabled rapid repositioning. This allowed Japanese forces to sustain pressure far longer than expected. American units on the beach attempted to adapt quickly. Commanders organized small groups to push inland, hoping to disrupt firing positions. But they discovered that the island did not operate like previous battlefields. Instead of facing isolated bunkers, they encountered a continuous defensive lattice with no obvious weak points. Some positions seemed abandoned, only to reveal new firing angles moments later. Smoke from burning equipment and volcanic dust reduced visibility and blurred orientation. Throughout this period, the underground network played a decisive role. Japanese forces relocated through tunnels that stretched from Mount Suribachi in the south to the northern cliffs. This system allowed them to appear unpredictably, retreat without detection, and maintain sustained fire despite the conditions on the surface. Attempts to silence particular firing points often resulted only in temporary relief. Within minutes, another position resumed fire from a different direction. Analysts would later compare the Japanese defensive layout to a subterranean fortress. Despite the heavy pre-landing bombardment, most of the system remained intact. Reinforced chambers survived near-direct hits, and ventilation shafts disguised among natural rock formations made locating strong points difficult. The island's geology, steep slopes, and soft black sand further complicated efforts to gain ground. What initially looked like open terrain was, in reality, a networked battlefield designed for endurance. As hours passed, the beach gradually stabilized, though at significant cost. Engineers managed to clear limited paths through the sand, allowing some vehicles to move inland. Infantry units found cover behind natural rises in the terrain or remnants of destroyed equipment. These incremental gains, however, did not diminish the level of danger. The defenders' strategy ensured that every advance was met with new layers of resistance. Kuribayashi's objective was never to repel the invasion outright. His aim was to inflict sustained attrition, altering the timeline of American operations in the Pacific. The initial 4-minute silence had enabled the highest possible concentration of targets. The subsequent eruption of fire turned the landing zone into a prolonged contest of endurance, rather than a rapid breakthrough. Military historians reviewing the battle later pointed to this early phase as a case study in defensive planning. Kuribayashi had redefined expectations by abandoning conventional shoreline defense and transforming the interior of the island into a controlled zone of interlocking fire. American forces, despite overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment, found themselves confronting an opponent who had used terrain, geology, and timing with exceptional effectiveness. The day of the landing continued with minimal change in tempo. Every attempt to advance met with new resistance. What had begun with 4 minutes of deceptive quiet became a prolonged struggle that would define the entire operation. As the battle for Iwo Jima continued, the significance of the first 4 minutes grew clearer to analysts observing the unfolding operation. Those brief moments had not simply been a tactical pause, they had shaped the entire tempo of the campaign. The density of troops, vehicles, and equipment on the beach during that silent interval created conditions that amplified the effectiveness of every hidden Japanese position once the order to fire was given. By the second and third days of fighting, American forces had secured limited footholds inland, yet progress remained slow. Each advance required engineers to dismantle or seal tunnels, clear cave entrances, and isolate strongly fortified pockets of resistance. The absence of a visible front line meant that even captured ground could become dangerous again without warning. Japanese defenders frequently reappeared through interconnected tunnel systems, challenging assumptions about what areas were truly secure. Over time, the pattern of resistance revealed the depth of Kuribayashi's planning. His intent was not to hold specific points, but to prolong the battle through movement and concealment. The underground network allowed small units to fight far beyond what surface conditions would have allowed. Even when supply lines were disrupted and ammunition ran low, defenders often found ways to reposition and continue coordinated fire. This persistence reinforced the conclusion that the early silence had been part of a broader strategy designed to maximize the efficiency of limited resources. Meanwhile, American forces relied heavily on engineering battalions and flamethrower teams to gradually dismantle the fortified system. Progress was methodical rather than rapid. Each captured tunnel, bunker, or cave required verification to ensure it was no longer connected to deeper passages. The volcanic terrain itself created obstacles. Steep ridges, loose sand, and limited natural cover slowed movements and complicated logistics. As the fighting moved northward, the beach where the first waves had landed no longer resembled the deceptively calm scene of the opening. Craters, wrecked vehicles, and defensive debris marked the area. Analysts studying the beachhead recognized how vulnerable the early concentration of forces had been. Had the defenders opened fire earlier, the landing might have dispersed more quickly, but far fewer troops would have been exposed at once. Kuribayashi's timing had transformed the beach into a focal point of the battle, magnifying the effects of his prepared positions. In the final days of the campaign, with Japanese resistance compressed into the northern cliffs, American commanders reviewed the operation's early reports. The 4-minute interval was repeatedly mentioned in debriefings, not as an anomaly, but as an example of calculated defensive discipline. Kuribayashi's refusal to respond immediately contradicted prior patterns of Pacific warfare and temporarily influenced tactical expectations. Planners studying the event concluded that the silence was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of intentional restraint. Despite the intensity of the battle, the broader outcome remained unchanged. American forces eventually secured the island, enabling the construction and use of critical airfields. These airstrips would later serve as emergency landing sites for hundreds of bombers returning from the Japanese mainland, saving thousands of aircrew lives during the final stages of the war. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima thus extended far beyond the immediate conflict. With the island secured, engineering units began surveying the battlefield. The scale and complexity of the underground defenses impressed even seasoned officers. Many structures had survived weeks of bombardment. Tunnel systems stretched farther and deeper than early intelligence estimates had suggested. For some analysts, the sophistication of the layout offered insight into how the first minutes had been engineered to achieve maximum effect. The 4-minute silence became a case study that endured long after the war. Military academies dissected the timing, underscoring how deception and patience could rival raw firepower. Historians noted that the event represented a rare moment in which a tactical pause dictated the shape of an entire battle rather than simply reflecting its circumstances. War correspondents who visited the island after the fighting ended often referenced the quiet beginning, contrasting it with the destructive intensity that followed. In the end, the mystery of those 4 minutes was not truly a mystery at all. It was the result of purposeful planning, executed with discipline in conditions that offered little hope of victory. The defenders had used silence as a weapon. The attackers had interpreted that silence as an advantage. The clash between these interpretations created one of the most dramatic transitions in the Pacific War. The beach, where thousands had landed in those first calm moments, became a symbol of the unpredictability of war. A reminder that the absence of danger can sometimes signal the exact moment when danger is at its peak.